The sharp squeal of a microphone pierced the hum of clinking glassware. My mother stood at the head of the banquet hall, tapping the metal mesh with a perfectly manicured fingernail. She wore a tailored ivory suit, smiling that practiced suburban smile she reserved for country club brunches and neighborhood association meetings. 50 guests sat around round tables draped in heavy white linen. I stood by the swinging kitchen doors, pressing a clipboard against my ribs, my feet aching from 12 hours of running damage control. "And we must give a special thanks to our dear Nina," my mother announced. Her voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings, dripping with a sugary sweetness that coated the venom underneath. She tried her very best to manage the catering budget, bless her heart. We only ran out of the good champagne twice, but we all know math is not her strong suit. The room erupted into polite, rippling laughter. My father chuckled softly from the head table, taking a slow sip of his drink. My older sister Alyssa covered her mouth, letting the vintage emerald ring on her left index finger catch the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. That was my grandmother's ring, the one promised to me. I did not flush. I did not push through the swinging doors and storm out into the damp Ohio night. I just watched them. I had spent the last 10 hours rerouting a lost food delivery, negotiating with a hostile vendor, and single-handedly saving my sister's extravagant engagement party from total ruin. Yet here I was, served up as a public punchline so my mother could elevate her favorite child. What none of those laughing guests knew what would soon make my mother drop that microphone and force my sister to slide that stolen emerald right off her finger was that I held a secret, a revelation that would shatter their carefully constructed reality down to the foundation. Before I reveal exactly how I dismantled my family's empire of lies, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Jessica Told Stories, but only if you genuinely enjoy real justice. I would love to know your age and what time it is wherever you are listening from right now. To comprehend why my own mother felt entitled to mock me in front of half of Columbus, you have to rewind 3 months. You have to go back to a freezing Tuesday in November, to the day my grandmother Vivian was buried in the hardened ground of the Appalachian foothills. In the afternoon, my mother reached into my coat and took what belonged to me. The sky over the cemetery had hung low and gray, spitting freezing rain onto the mahogany casket. But the true friction began 72 hours earlier in a sterile hospital room that smelled of rubbing alcohol and fading time. My grandmother Vivian was not a warm woman. She did not bake cookies or knit sweaters. She was a woman of ledgers and sharp observations. We understood each other. On her last night, her grip on my wrist felt like brittle kindling, yet her gaze remained piercing. She did not offer poetic goodbyes. She pulled me close, her breath rattling in her chest, and whispered 5 words into my ear: zoning permits and highway access. At the time, I talked it up to morphine-induced delirium. I stroked her silver hair, unaware she had just handed me the map to an empire. The real betrayal unfolded the morning after we put her in the ground. We stood in Vivian's quiet foyer, sorting through the immediate aftermath of death. The air in the house felt heavy, thick with the scent of old paper and dried lavender. I wore my heavy wool trench coat, preparing to drive back to my apartment. The midnight blue velvet jewelry box rested deep inside my right pocket. Vivian had promised me that ring when I was 12. She recognized a shared pragmatic spine in me, a resilience that had somehow skipped a generation. I traced the velvet through the fabric of my coat, finding a small measure of comfort in its solid shape. My mother stepped into the hallway, blocking the front door. She did not ask. She did not negotiate. Her eyes tracked straight to the subtle bulge in my pocket. "Hand it over, Nina," Karen said. Her tone was flat, devoid of grief, sounding more like a manager auditing inventory. "Grandma gave this to me," I replied, keeping my voice even. Before I could step around her, my mother lunged forward. Her fingers slipped into my pocket with unnerving precision, extracting the velvet box before I could react. She popped the lid open. The square-cut emerald sat nestled in yellow gold, dark and rich against the faded silk interior. "This," Karen declared, snapping the box shut, "belongs with the eldest daughter. It is a family heirloom, not a toy." Alyssa emerged from the living room, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. At 29, my sister operated under the delusion that her life was a movie and everyone else was a supporting extra. She spent her days staging aesthetic photos for social media, subsidized entirely by our parents' bank accounts. Karen crossed the hardwood floor and presented the open box to Alyssa. My sister gasped, a sound so rehearsed it belonged on a stage. "Nina works in those dirty shipping terminals," my mother added, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. "She would just ruin it on a pallet jack or lose it in some warehouse. You, Alyssa, have the lifestyle for a piece like this." I worked as a supply chain analyst. I spent 50-hour weeks managing complex freight routes across Lake Erie ports and industrial sectors. I did not drive pallet jacks. But to my mother, my grueling corporate career was just a gritty, unglamorous hobby compared to Alyssa's curated internet presence. Alyssa set her tea down and slid the vintage band onto her index finger. It hung loose. The ring was sized for knuckles thickened by decades of hard work, but Alyssa curled her hand into a fist to keep it secured, admiring the sparkle. "It fits perfectly," Alyssa lied, admiring her own reflection in the hallway mirror. "Grandma always said I had elegant hands." Vivian had never said that. Vivian had once told Alyssa her hands looked like they had never done a hard day of work in their life. But truth held no currency in this house. I looked at my mother. Her chin tilted upward, daring me to start a battle she was already prepared to win. She wanted a reaction. She craved the spectacle of a weeping, jealous younger sibling to validate her carefully constructed hierarchy. If I fought her, she would twist the story, calling me greedy and insensitive for starting a fight mere hours after a funeral. The metallic taste of injustice pooled in the back of my throat. I looked at the emerald shining on my sister's fist, then at the triumphant smirk resting on my mother's face. I realized then that fighting Karen in open waters was a fool's errand. She controlled the currents. She owned the narrative. So I swallowed the anger. I buttoned my coat, picked up my car keys from the console table, and walked out into the damp Ohio chill without saying another word. I stepped off the porch, the freezing rain biting at my cheeks. The drive back to Columbus took 2 hours, giving me plenty of time to sit with the hollow ache in my chest. I routed trucks and managed million-dollar supply chains for a living. I optimized paths to eliminate waste and mitigate risk. Yet when it came to my own family, I was constantly running at a deficit. I was the shock absorber for their dysfunction, the invisible workhorse expected to carry the weight while Alyssa took the credit. Gripping the steering wheel, I remembered the weight of the velvet box in my hand just moments before it was snatched away. That emerald was the only piece of Vivian I had left. It was a token of recognition, a silent nod from the only person who saw me for who I truly was. And my mother had repurposed it into a prop for Alyssa's ego. I pulled into the parking lot of my modest apartment complex, the gray sky pressing down on the bare trees. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A notification lit up the screen. It was an alert from Instagram. Alyssa had already uploaded a photo. I did not need to open the app to know what she had posted. The theft was finished. The narrative was already being spun, and my role as the bitter, inadequate sister was cemented in their minds. I turned the ignition off and sat in the quiet cab of my car. I let the cold seep into my bones, letting it harden something soft and vulnerable inside me. My mother thought she had written the ending to this story. She had no idea she had only just handed me the pen. The glowing screen illuminated the dim interior of my sedan. I tapped the notification and felt the cold air outside seep straight into my bones. There it was. My sister's hand fingers delicately curled around a porcelain teacup, the vintage square-cut stone resting proudly on her index finger. The caption read, "Grandma knew I was her favorite, always carrying her with me." The digital hearts piled up underneath the image, a cascading waterfall of validation for a stolen legacy. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. By Monday morning, the hollow ache in my chest had hardened into a cold, functional rhythm. My workspace sat on the second floor of a bustling logistics hub in downtown Columbus, a glass-enclosed nerve center overlooking endless rows of shipping containers. I spent 50 hours a week orchestrating the movement of raw materials and retail goods across the industrial arteries of the Midwest. If a blizzard stalled a fleet of semi-trucks near the Appalachian foothills, I rerouted them. If a cargo ship faced delays at the Lake Erie ports, I recalculated the downstream supply chain to prevent assembly lines from halting. I was eating a cold turkey sandwich wrapped in foil, my eyes tracking 3 different monitors displaying real-time GPS coordinates. The air in the office hummed with the constant drone of HVAC units and the sharp chatter of dispatchers on headsets. My occupation required precision foresight and an ability to absorb high-stakes pressure without breaking. I was highly competent. I was also utterly invisible to my own family. Between radio calls, my mind drifted back to the ring now being paraded across the internet. It was not a flawless gem. Vivian had taught me about emeralds when I was a young girl, sitting across from her at her worn kitchen table. True emeralds possess what jewelers call jardin, the French word for garden. They are internal fractures, tiny branching inclusions trapped inside the stone during its formation, deep within the earth. To an untrained eye, they might look like cracks, but those imperfections are what prove the stone is genuine. They are the scars of surviving immense geological pressure. Vivian used to say that the jardin made the emerald tough. It meant the stone had endured the weight of the world. That was why she wanted me to wear it. We shared that exact same internal architecture. We both carried our fractures quietly, using them to reinforce our spines rather than begging for sympathy. Alyssa did not understand the jardin. To my sister, a flaw was a tragedy needing a filter. She existed in a fragile state of constant performance, requiring endless financial subsidies from our parents to maintain the illusion of success. Her vanity was brittle, prone to shattering the moment reality intruded on her curated aesthetic. She wore a symbol of resilience to pose for strangers, wholly oblivious to the heavy, unglamorous history resting on her knuckle. The true extent of my mother's revisionist history revealed itself 5 days later. Every Sunday, attendance at my parents' suburban home was mandatory. It was a ritual designed to showcase their idyllic family life to whatever extended relatives happened to drop by. This particular evening, Aunt Susan sat across from me at the formal dining table, passing a heavy ceramic bowl of roasted vegetables. Susan's eyes darted to Alyssa's left hand. She paused, the serving spoon hovering in midair. "That piece is stunning, Alyssa. Is that Vivian's ring? I thought she promised that to Nina years ago." The clinking of silverware against porcelain ceased. The dining room grew suffocatingly quiet. I kept my gaze fixed on my plate, cutting a piece of dry chicken, waiting to see how my mother would navigate the trap. Karen did not even flinch. She offered a soft maternal sigh, delicately adjusting her linen napkin. "Well, Susan, we did discuss it," my mother lied, her voice drifting across the table like a gentle breeze. But Nina works in those dirty shipping warehouses. She is always lugging heavy boxes around, and she is just so clumsy with her hands. She admitted she did not want the responsibility of looking after such a delicate antique. She was terrified of ruining it on a forklift. I stopped chewing. The audacity of the fiction took my breath away. I did not work in a dirty warehouse. I worked in a corporate command center. I had never driven a forklift in my life. I managed complex data architectures that kept millions of dollars of freight moving across state lines. It really belongs with the eldest daughter anyway, my father chimed in. David poured himself another glass of Merlot, nodding in agreement with his wife's fabricated reality. Alyssa attends so many networking events for her lifestyle brand. It gives the heirloom the exposure it deserves. Susan smiled, easily digesting the convenient narrative. That makes perfect sense. Very practical of you, Nina. I stared at the grain of the mahogany table, my fingernails biting into my palms under the table. If I spoke up now, if I called my mother a thief in front of Susan, Karen would instantly pivot to playing the victim. She would clutch her pearls, shed a single tear, and lament how the grief of losing Vivian was making me lash out. She would paint me as unhinged and jealous. The story would no longer be about a stolen ring. It would be about my emotional instability. They were not just taking my inheritance. They were actively rewriting my identity. They needed me to be incompetent, clumsy, and unambitious to justify their favoritism. They needed me to be a failure so Alyssa could be a star. I swallowed the dry food in my mouth. I forced a tight, agreeable nod, playing the role they had scripted for me. I let them believe they had won. I let them think my silence was submission. Dinner concluded with dessert and forced pleasantries. I grabbed my trench coat from the hall tree, desperate to escape the suffocating air of that house. Alyssa was busy showing Susan the specific angle she used to capture the stone's sparkle for her followers. Karen stood by the door, offering me a tight, victorious smile as I stepped out onto the front porch. I walked down the driveway, my boots crunching on the frost-covered concrete. The biting wind whipped across my face, clearing the heavy fog of the dining room from my mind. I needed to get back to my apartment. I needed to retreat into my quiet, independent life, far away from their toxic theater. I climbed into my 10-year-old sedan, shivering as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine groaned a sluggish, metallic grinding sound that I had been trying to ignore for weeks. It sputtered, choked, and finally roared to life, but a bright orange warning light illuminated the dashboard. My stomach dropped. The timing could not have been worse. I shifted into gear, the transmission jerking with a brutal force. As I pulled out onto the dark suburban street, a loud clunk echoed from beneath the chassis, followed by a terrifying hiss. The car shuddered, losing speed rapidly. I pulled over onto the shoulder, gripping the steering wheel as the engine died, leaving me stranded in the bitter Ohio cold. I stared at the dark dashboard, calculating the sparse balance in my checking account. The cost of a tow truck alone would decimate my grocery budget. I was about to discover just how steep the price of being the unfavored daughter truly was, and my family was about to show me exactly what happens when the scapegoat runs out of money. The mechanic wiped grease from his hands with a stained red rag leaning over the rusted hood of my sedan. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed in the frigid garage. It was Thursday evening, 3 days after the engine died on the side of that suburban road. "The transmission is completely shot," he said, his voice flat, offering no sympathy. "It is going to be $2,200 to rebuild it, and that is if we do not find any cracked seals once we get in there." I stared at the concrete floor, my breath pluming in the cold air. $2,200. My checking account held exactly $412. I handed him my only credit card. It was a card I kept strictly for emergencies, with a limit I had carefully managed for 3 years. The mechanic swiped it. The machine beeped, approving the charge, and just like that, my financial safety net vanished. The card was maxed out. I was officially operating without a wire. With the car in the shop for 2 weeks, my meticulously scheduled life fractured. I had to rely on the Columbus public transit system to reach the logistics terminal downtown. Every morning at 5:30, I stood at the corner of Broad and High, bracing against the icy Ohio wind that whipped off the Scioto River. The bus route added 45 minutes to my commute. It also altered my view. Instead of the fast lane of the interstate, the heavy diesel engine lumbered through the expanding industrial sectors on the outskirts of the city. Every morning, I pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window, watching the landscape shift. We passed a massive, sprawling commercial corridor. It was a booming hub of fulfillment centers, cross-dock facilities, and freight terminals. Hundreds of semi-trucks idled at loading bays, their exhaust mingling with the low-hanging gray clouds. The signage read, Greenstone Industrial Park. It was prime real estate, positioned perfectly near the major highway junctions. I recognized the logos on the warehouses. They were the very same freight companies whose supply chains I managed every day at work. I watched the movement of the trucks, calculating transit times and efficiency metrics in my head, completely unaware that this specific stretch of concrete and steel would soon dictate the rest of my life. The financial strain was immediate and suffocating. By Tuesday, I was rationing peanut butter and calculating whether I could skip paying the electric bill for 1 month without penalty. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket while I was waiting for the bus home in the freezing rain. I pulled it out with numb fingers. A notification flashed on the screen. It was a Venmo request from Alyssa. The amount was $850. The note attached read, "Splitting the cost of resetting Grandma's ring. Love you, sis." I stared at the bright screen, the numbers blurring for a second. The audacity was staggering. My sister, who had stolen my inheritance, who was currently parading it across the internet for strangers, now expected me to subsidize its modification. The vintage band was slightly too large for her pristine, unworked fingers. Rather than pay for the sizing herself, she assumed I would obediently fund the alteration of the very item she had taken from me. I dismissed the notification and shoved the phone back into my pocket. An hour later, I sat in the small, cramped kitchen of my apartment, staring at a stack of overdue utility bills. The radiator clanked weakly in the corner, failing to combat the draft leaking through the poorly sealed window. I needed a bridge loan. Just $500 to cover groceries and the electricity bill until my next paycheck cleared. I dialed my father's number. David Stevens was a man who measured success in square footage and country club memberships. He was the vice president of regional sales for a mid-sized pharmaceutical company, a position that afforded him a comfortable suburban life and a profound lack of empathy for anyone navigating financial struggle. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. The background noise was loud, filled with the clinking of glasses and the low murmur of conversation. He was at his favorite steakhouse. "Nina," he said, his tone brisk and impatient. "What is it?" "I am in the middle of dinner with clients." "Dad, I need a favor." I started keeping my voice steady, suppressing the desperation clawing at my throat. My transmission blew. The repair wiped out my savings and my credit card. "I just need a small loan, $500 to get me through the week. I will pay you back on the 1st. A heavy sigh crackled through the receiver. I could picture him pinching the bridge of his nose, deeply inconvenienced by my existence. "Nina, we have talked about this," he lectured, his voice dropping into that condescending paternal register he used when he wanted to feel superior. "You are 26 years old. You need to learn how to manage your money better. If you lived within your means, a simple car repair would not be a crisis." I work 50 hours a week, Dad, I replied, my grip tightening on the phone. The repair was $2,000. I just need a bridge. I am not a bank, Nina, he said coldly. Enabling poor financial habits does not help you in the long run. Figure it out. It builds character. He hung up without saying goodbye. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a flat mechanical sound that perfectly matched the chill in my apartment. I set the phone down on the worn Formica counter. I knew exactly where his disposable income was currently directed. Just 2 days prior, Karen had boasted in the family group chat about Alyssa's upcoming weekend trip to Chicago. My parents had covered her first-class flights and booked a suite at the Drake Hotel, claiming the influencer needed a change of scenery to cope with the grief of losing Vivienne. They were funding luxurious vacations for the sister who worked 5 hours a week while refusing basic survival assistance to the sister grinding through 50-hour shifts. The hypocrisy was not just suffocating. It was enlightening. Any residual hope that my parents might eventually see my value evaporated in that cold kitchen. The illusion of family support burned away, leaving behind a stark, undeniable reality. They did not view me as a daughter. They viewed me as a utility. I was expected to absorb their stress, manage their logistics, and fund my sister's vanity, all while asking for absolutely nothing in return. The shock of the betrayal finally settled, transforming into something far more dangerous. It crystallized into a cold, focused survival instinct. I realized that arguing with them was useless. Appealing to their sense of fairness was a waste of breath. If I was going to survive this family, I had to stop playing by their rules. I had to become as calculated and ruthless as the supply chains I managed. My phone buzzed again on the counter. Another text message from Alyssa. Hey, did you see the Venmo request she wrote? The jeweler needs the deposit by tomorrow so they can start working on the platinum setting. Let me know when you send it. I did not reply. I deleted the message. Let her wait. Let her explain to the jeweler why her credit card bounced. My silence was no longer a symptom of submission. It was the first move in a very long game. I opened my laptop, pulling up my bank statements and creating a rigid, unforgiving budget for the next month. I would eat rice and beans. I would wear extra sweaters instead of turning up the heat. I would endure the agonizing bus commute past the sprawling industrial parks. But I would not give them another dime. And I would never ask them for help again. The next morning, the Ohio wind felt less like a punishment and more like a challenge. I boarded the crowded commuter bus, taking my usual seat by the window. As we rumbled past the Greenstone Industrial Park, I watched the semi-trucks pulling out of the logistics bays, their headlights cutting through the morning fog. I traced the cracks in the frost on the window pane, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. My mother thought she had secured her legacy by taking a piece of jewelry. She did not realize that the real inheritance was still waiting to be claimed, and the map was currently locked away in a dusty house I was about to be forced to clean. The estate of Vivienne Reynolds was a 2-story colonial situated at the end of a cul-de-sac in a quiet, aging suburb of Columbus. It was a house built on practicality, not prestige. The exterior paint was peeling and the gutters sagged under the weight of wet Ohio leaves. My grandmother had lived there for 42 years, occupying the space with a calculated frugality that my mother had always found embarrassing. Karen summoned the family to the property on a Saturday morning, armed with an arsenal of cardboard boxes and an agenda. "We need to clear this place out immediately," my mother announced, standing in the center of the dusty living room. "The real estate market is hot right now. We cannot afford to let this property sit and accrue taxes." Alyssa stood by the front door, wearing a pristine beige trench coat and refusing to touch anything that might compromise her manicure. She held a steaming cup of artisan coffee, looking around the room as if it were a biohazard zone. I cannot even look at her favorite armchair, Alyssa said, her voice trembling with practiced theatricality. It is just too overwhelming. I am drowning in grief. Karen placed a comforting hand on her eldest daughter's shoulder. I know, sweetie. It is too soon for you. You need to focus on your mental health. My mother turned to me. Her expression shifted from nurturing warmth to administrative coldness in a fraction of a second. Nina, you are going to have to handle the heavy lifting here, Karen ordered. Alyssa is far too fragile right now, and your father and I are swamped with the Neighborhood Association Gala next week. Since you are single and do not have any real social commitments, this can be your project. I looked at the towering stacks of yellowed newspapers, the heavy oak furniture, and the decades of accumulated life scattered across 3 floors. It was a massive undertaking, requiring weeks of physical labor. My mother was assigning me the role of unpaid domestic staff, framing it as an expectation rather than a request. I am working 50-hour weeks at the terminal, Mom, I said, keeping my tone level. I do not have the bandwidth to clear an entire estate by myself. Karen crossed her arms. We all make sacrifices for family, Nina. Stop acting like you are the only person with a job. You can do this on evenings and weekends. It is the least you can do considering you did not even offer to help with the funeral arrangements. I did not offer to help with the funeral because my mother had deliberately excluded me from every meeting with the funeral director, insisting that only she and David had the aesthetic vision to plan a proper service. The gaslighting was so seamless, so deeply ingrained in her communication style, that it almost felt reflexive. I did not argue. I grabbed a roll of packing tape and a stack of boxes. I had already made the decision to stop fighting battles I could not win. For the next 10 days, my life devolved into a grueling cycle of exhaustion. I woke up at 5, took the freezing commuter bus past the Greenstone Industrial Park, managed supply chain crises until 6 in the evening, and then rode another bus to Vivienne's house. I spent my nights breathing in decades of dust, sorting through moth-eaten sweaters and chipped porcelain tea sets. My muscles ached, my hands blistered. My bank account remained perilously low. The reality of my maxed-out credit card hanging over me like a guillotine. It was during my second weekend of clearing that my mother made her discovery. Karen had stopped by the house under the guise of helping, though she primarily spent the hour scrolling through her phone and directing my labor. I was struggling to haul a heavy television out of the guest room when I heard her gasp from the master bedroom. I dropped the television onto the carpet and walked down the hall. My mother was standing by Vivian's nightstand, clutching a single sheet of paper. Her eyes were wide, shining with an unrestrained, voracious excitement. I found it, Karen whispered, her voice trembling with genuine emotion. Found what? Her will, my mother said, holding the paper up like a trophy. I knew it. I knew she would do the right thing eventually. I walked over and looked at the document. It was a printed draft dated 12 years ago. It was not on legal letterhead, and there was no notary stamp or witness signature at the bottom. The text was simple, stating that Vivian Reynolds left the entirety of her estate to her only daughter, Karen Stevens. Mom, that is an unsigned draft, I pointed out, noting the lack of legal execution. It is over a decade old. It is not legally binding. Karen snatched the paper away, glaring at me as if I had just insulted a religious text. You are always so negative, Nina. This is clearly her intent. The lawyers will honor it. It proves everything goes to me. The discovery of the unnotarized draft triggered a terrifying shift in my mother. Whatever restraint she previously possessed vanished, replaced by a dangerous, unchecked arrogance. She began operating under the delusion that she was already wealthy. Later that afternoon, while I was scrubbing the linoleum in the kitchen, I overheard Karen on the phone with one of her suburban friends. Yes, the entire estate, my mother boasted, her voice echoing through the empty house. It is quite a substantial windfall. We are already looking at upgrading the kitchen countertops, and David is talking about putting a deposit down on that boat he has been eyeing. No, we are not worried about the probate timeline. The intent is clear. We are practically liquid. I wrung out a sponge into a bucket of cloudy water, listening to her spend money she did not actually possess. The irony was suffocating. My mother was berating me for lacking financial management skills while simultaneously banking her future on a piece of scrap paper she found in a drawer. The physical toll of the house clearing peaked on a rainy Tuesday evening. The logistics terminal had been brutal that day, dealing with a major freight derailment that threw half my schedules into chaos. I arrived at Vivian's house near midnight, completely drained, running on less than 4 hours of sleep. I sat down at the worn kitchen table, too exhausted to pack another box. The table was scratched, marked by years of use. Staring at the wood grain, a memory surfaced, breaking through the fog of my fatigue. I was 10 years old. The kitchen smelled of percolating coffee and lemon pledge. I was sitting at this exact table, swinging my legs, while Vivienne sat across from me. She had a thick, leather-bound ledger open in front of her. My mother and Alyssa had gone to Columbus for a child beauty pageant, an enterprise that consumed vast amounts of my parents' income and attention. I had been left behind with my grandmother, deemed too disruptive to attend. Vivian tapped a line of numbers in the ledger with a sharp pencil. "Do you know what this is, Nina?" she had asked, her voice raspy but sharp. "Math," I replied, shrugging. "It is leverage," Vivian corrected. "It is the difference between what people see and what actually exists. Your mother thinks wealth is what you wear on your wrist. She is a fool. Real power is what you own when nobody is looking." She had spent the next 2 hours teaching a 10-year-old how to balance a double-entry accounting sheet. She showed me how to track assets, liabilities, and equity. She did not treat me like a child. She treated me like a partner. Sitting in the cold, empty house 15 years later, the memory shifted my entire perspective. I looked around the peeling wallpaper and the sagging ceiling. My family viewed Vivian as a stubborn, eccentric old woman clinging to a dilapidated property. They assumed her estate consisted solely of this house and a modest pension. They fundamentally misunderstood who she was. Vivienne was not a woman who left things to chance, and she certainly was not a woman who would leave her legacy on an unnotarized piece of paper in a nightstand. A spark of curiosity ignited in my chest, cutting through the exhaustion. If Vivienne understood leverage, if she believed in owning assets when nobody was looking, then this house was not the end of the story. It was a smokescreen. I stood up from the kitchen table. The fatigue was gone, replaced by a sharp, calculating adrenaline. I walked toward the back of the house, toward the small, cramped room Vivian had used as an office. I was no longer packing boxes as an unpaid servant. I was searching. And I was about to find the very thing my mother had missed. It was 2 a.m. on a Thursday when my physical endurance finally shattered. The temperature inside Vivian's house had dropped into the low 40s, but I could not afford to run the central heating just to keep myself warm while I worked. I sat on the bare, scuffed floorboards of the study, surrounded by half-filled cardboard boxes and heavy black trash bags stuffed with decades of discarded mail. My hands were covered in tiny, stinging paper cuts. My lower back throbbed with a dull, relentless ache from hauling garbage to the curb for 6 consecutive nights. I leaned my head against the faded floral wallpaper, closing my eyes as a wave of profound isolation washed over me. I had reached the absolute limit of my capacity. My emergency credit card was maxed out to pay for a transmission repair. I was rationing my groceries, skipping meals to ensure I could afford the bus fare to my logistics job. Yet, here I was, spending my only free hours acting as an unpaid maid for a mother who openly despised me and a sister who paraded my stolen inheritance for digital applause. A cold, insidious whisper crept into my mind, telling me that Karen was right. Maybe I was just the family workhorse. Maybe my destiny was simply to absorb the friction of other people's lives existing only to make their existence smoother. I forced my eyes open, refusing to let the despair root itself permanently in my chest. I had one more piece of furniture to prep for the estate liquidators before I could allow myself to sleep. It was Vivian's desk, a heavy, imposing structure carved from dark oak sitting in the corner of the room like a silent sentinel. It had been her command center, the place where she balanced her checkbook and organized her sparse utility bills. I dragged myself up from the floor, my knees popping loudly in the quiet room. I pulled out the top drawers, stacking them carefully on the rug. They were empty, smelling strongly of dry cedar and old brass polish. I moved to the bottom right drawer, grasping the tarnished metal handle. It stuck. I pulled harder, using my entire body weight to force the swollen wood to slide along its tracks. The drawer jerked free, tumbling out of the casing and hitting the floorboards with an odd, hollow thud. It sounded wrong. Solid oak is incredibly dense. The drawer should have landed with a heavy, deadened impact. I knelt beside the overturned wood, running my bare fingertips along the underside. The grain felt different here, thinner, far less polished than the rest of the piece. I pressed my palm against the interior base panel and applied pressure. It shifted slightly under my weight. My pulse quickened, a sudden rhythm drumming against my ribs. I wedged my fingernails into a microscopic gap along the corner seam and pulled upward. A thin panel of cedar snapped loose. It was a false bottom, concealing a hidden compartment about 2 inches deep. Taped to the underside of the wooden panel was a small, heavy brass key. Beside it lay a rectangular metal lockbox painted a dull, matte black. It was the kind of fireproof document container you might find tucked away in a hardware store, unremarkable and easily overlooked by anyone who was not paying close attention. I peeled the tape away, freeing the brass key. My hands trembled, not from the freezing air of the house, but from the sharp spike of adrenaline flooding my veins. I inserted the key into the lockbox. The mechanism turned with a satisfying oiled click. I lifted the heavy lid, unsure of what I would find. There were no stacks of cash inside. There were no hidden jewels or gold coins. Instead, resting on top of a thick manila folder was a single, unlined, white index card. The handwriting on the card was unmistakable. It was the sharp, slanted script of my grandmother, written with a steady hand. The ink was dark and unfaded. I picked up the card, bringing it closer to the dim yellow glow of the single desk lamp. The message consisted of 3 short sentences. They will try to take what shines, Nina. Let them. Wait for Thorn. I read the words again, and then a third time. The stale air in the room seemed to pull away, leaving me breathless. Vivian knew. She had known all along. She anticipated the immediate, ravenous greed that would consume Karen the moment her heart stopped beating. She knew my mother would reach into my pocket and confiscate the emerald ring. The instruction left for me was clear and unyielding. Let them take the shiny, superficial things. Let them distract themselves with the illusion of victory. Wait for Thorn. I did not know who Thorn was, but the name echoed with a quiet, undeniable authority. It sounded like a promise. I set the index card down on the carpet and reached for the thick manila folder beneath it. I opened the cover, flipping through crisp, notarized pages of legal jargon, tax assessments, and commercial deeds. The documents were stamped with the official blue seal of the state of Ohio. My eyes scanned the headers, landing on the bold print at the top of the primary incorporation paper. Greenstone Holdings, LLC, sole proprietor, Vivian Reynolds. I traced the printed letters with my index finger. my analytical mind racing to connect the pieces of data. Greenstone, the Emerald, the sprawling industrial park on the outskirts of Columbus, the one I now passed every single morning on my agonizing commuter bus route, was branded with that exact name. Greenstone Industrial Park. I flipped frantically to the property schedules attached to the LLC documents. 200 acres of prime commercial real estate, zoned exclusively for heavy logistics, positioned directly adjacent to the major highway interchange. The very same asphalt where hundreds of semi-trucks loaded and unloaded freight every day. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow stealing the breath from my lungs. My parents, obsessed with country clubs, luxury vehicles, and outward displays of suburban wealth, had looked at Vivian's peeling paint and decade-old sedan and assumed she was barely scraping by. They equated frugality with poverty, but Vivian had been playing an entirely different game. She lived vastly below her means as a form of camouflage. She weaponized their superficiality against them, knowing they would never bother to look past the worn carpet and the dusty furniture. They saw a frail old woman in a decaying colonial house. They never saw the ruthless commercial landlord collecting heavy six-figure leases from corporate freight companies. The crushing weight of my victimhood evaporated in that cold, empty study. The physical exhaustion vanished, replaced by a crystalline, tactical focus. I was not the tragic, discarded daughter anymore. I was the sole custodian of a secret empire. My mother was currently parading around her suburban social circles, bragging about a worthless, unsigned draft of a will she found in a nightstand, truly believing she had conquered the estate. She thought she was the apex predator in this family dynamic, but she was merely walking blindly into a trap my grandmother had set years in advance. I carefully placed the commercial deeds back into the manila folder. I returned the index card to its place, closed the heavy lid of the lockbox, and turned the key. I slid the metal container back into the hidden compartment, snapping the false cedar bottom firmly into place. I stood up, brushing the thick dust from the knees of my jeans. The rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. I no longer needed to survive my family. I just needed to run the clock out until this mysterious thorn revealed himself. As I locked the front door of the estate and walked out into the freezing Ohio night, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. The screen illuminated the dark driveway. It was a text message from my mother, demanding I report to her house the following evening to discuss a mandatory family project. Alyssa's new fiancé, Chad, wanted a spectacular engagement party to impress his colleagues, and Karen had just volunteered my professional logistical services to plan the entire event for free. I smiled in the dark, the cold wind whipping my hair across my face. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I would play the perfect obedient servant. I would source their caterers and organize their timelines. I would let them take what shines, because they had no idea what was waiting for them in the shadows. The invitation to Sunday dinner arrived with an undertone of frantic urgency. When I pulled my struggling 10-year-old sedan into the driveway, a pristine leased silver vehicle already occupied the prime parking spot. Chad had officially entered the narrative. Chad was a regional sales representative for a mid-tier software vendor. He wore quarter-zip pullovers, spoke in empty corporate buzzwords, and possessed the blind confidence of a man who navigated life on the lowest difficulty setting. We sat around the formal dining table. The scent of roasted rosemary chicken mingled with the sharp, overwhelming notes of Chad's designer cologne. Alyssa practically vibrated with rehearsed excitement. She raised her left hand, adjusting her wrist so the overhead pendant lighting would strike the facets of her new, 2-carat, lab-grown diamond ring. My gaze drifted to her right hand. The vintage emerald, the heirloom stolen from my coat pocket just weeks prior, rested prominently on her index finger. The juxtaposition of the two stones told a bitter story. One represented an aesthetic transaction. The other represented a hijacked legacy. "We are hosting a celebration," my mother announced, raising her wine glass. Her eyes sparkled with the terrifying thrill of a woman who had just found a new stage to produce a play. Not just a dinner, a real event. The Country Club Ballroom. "We need a string quartet, an open bar, and a seated dinner for at least 100 guests. This engagement sets the tone for the entire wedding season." My father nodded along, carving the chicken with precise, deliberate strokes. He looked pleased, mostly because an extravagant social event provided another avenue to network with his pharmaceutical clients under the guise of family duty. Karen turned her focus across the table, her gaze locking onto me. The warmth drained from her expression, replaced by the calculating stare of a project manager assigning tasks to a subordinate. "Nina, you are going to handle the logistics. You organize freight routes for a living. Booking a few florists and coordinating a catering timeline should be effortless for you. Alyssa is too overwhelmed with her influencer collaborations to manage vendor contracts, and I am far too busy finalizing the guest list." Before the discovery of the brass lockbox, this demand would have crushed me. I would have argued. I would have pointed out the grueling 50-hour weeks I already spent untangling supply chain disasters at the terminal. I would have begged for a boundary. But the woman sitting at that dining table was no longer the desperate, unfavored daughter seeking approval. I was the sole proprietor of Greenstone Holdings. I knew the truth about Vivian's wealth, and that secret knowledge acted as an impenetrable shield against my mother's manipulation. I took a slow sip of ice water. I set the glass down on the coaster, maintaining a steady rhythm in my breathing. "I would be happy to organize the party, Mom," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat and compliant. "Just send me the budget breakdown and the preferred dates." Karen blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by my lack of resistance. She exchanged a quick, victorious glance with Alyssa, silently congratulating themselves on breaking my spirit. They interpreted my compliance as defeat. They had no idea I was simply playing a role, biding my time until the trap snapped shut. For the next month, my small apartment transformed into a secondary command center. After spending 10 hours a day managing the flow of commercial freight across the Midwest, I would sit at my cramped kitchen table until past midnight, building color-coded spreadsheets for my sister's vanity project. I negotiated with linen rental companies, mapped out seating charts, and tracked deposit deadlines. I treated the engagement party the same way I treated a delayed shipment of automotive parts. I removed all emotion and focused purely on execution. Alyssa's contributions consisted exclusively of sending me erratic text messages at odd hours. She would forward links to elaborate ice sculptures or demand specialty floral arches imported from out of state, offering zero consideration for the budget or the physical reality of acquiring such items on short notice. When we met at a local bakery for a cake tasting, she spent the hour ignoring the pastry chef, too busy recording videos for her followers. She waved her hands dramatically as she spoke, ensuring the emerald ring flashed directly in my line of sight. "It is just so exhausting being the bride," Alyssa sighed, taking a minuscule bite of a raspberry fondant sample. "Chad is practically useless with aesthetics, and Mom is obsessing over the seating chart. Thank goodness you have all this free time to handle the boring background stuff, Nina. You are so good at doing the invisible work." I stared at the green stone on her finger. I pictured the heavily guarded commercial deeds locked inside my hidden metal box. I offered her a polite, vacant nod, writing down the bakery's delivery protocol on my clipboard. The invisible work was exactly where the real power lived. My sister was fixated on the frosting. I owned the land the bakery was built on. The true depth of my mother's delusion became apparent during a venue walkthrough at the country club. The ballroom smelled of lemon polish and old wealth, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a manicured golf course. Karen had invited 3 of her closest friends from the neighborhood association to accompany us, eager to flaunt her upcoming social triumph. I stood by the coat check, verifying the square footage for the band's staging area, while Karen held court near the grand fireplace. Her voice carried across the empty room, pitched specifically to ensure everyone within a 50-foot radius could hear her. "Oh, we are not worried about the expense," Karen boasted, waving a hand dismissively as one of her friends asked about the open bar costs. "Vivian's estate is going to cover the wedding entirely. We found her paperwork last month. The house alone will fetch a premium in this market, and once probate clears, Alyssa will have the fairy tale she deserves." It is just such a relief to know my mother did the right thing in the end. I marked a check on my clipboard, pressing the pen firmly into the paper to keep my hands from shaking with suppressed amusement. The dramatic irony was a tangible force in the room thick enough to cut. My mother was standing in a rented country club boasting to her wealthy peers about spending an inheritance that did not belong to her, based entirely on a decade-old, legally worthless scrap of paper. She was building an extravagant house of cards on a foundation of sand, and she had drafted me to design the blueprints. I knew Attorney Mitchell Thorne was currently processing the real irrevocable trust documents. I knew the timeline. Every boast my mother made, every vendor contract she authorized, every dollar she mentally spent from Vivian's estate was pulling her deeper into an inescapable financial snare. I did not need to correct her. The law would correct her soon enough. I continued playing the quiet, dutiful servant, confirming the florist, finalizing the catering menu, and shielding my family from the logistical friction of their own demands. I absorbed their casual cruelties, their dismissive remarks, and their endless vanity. I became a ghost in my own life, functioning solely to guarantee their celebration went off without a single flaw. But the illusion of endless wealth began to crack just a week before the event. The vendors required their final, non-refundable payments. The country club, the florist, and the premium catering service all sent their invoices simultaneously. The total ran into the high 5 figures. Karen had assumed she could string the vendors along until the estate liquidated, but corporate event planners do not operate on promises, and unnotarized wills, they operate on cleared funds. The pressure fractured my mother's carefully curated composure. Her suburban facade dissolved, replaced by a desperate, frantic panic. The bill for the floral arrangements alone had spiraled far beyond the original estimate, and the catering company refused to load their trucks without the final deposit. As I stood in my parents' kitchen holding a stack of past-due invoices, the snare I had been waiting for finally tightened, and my mother turned her extortion tactics directly onto me. The financial pressure cooker finally exploded 7 days before Alyssa's engagement party. The catalyst was a seemingly innocuous email from the florist confirming an imported shipment of white orchids. The arrangement was a late addition, requested by my sister, who had decided the venue needed a more ethereal aesthetic for her Instagram aesthetic. The change pushed the already bloated floral budget over the edge, creating a cascading deficit that impacted the catering schedule. I stood at the bakery counter on Thursday afternoon, picking up the dessert samples. The display cases were filled with delicate pastries and heavy cream cakes. I handed the cashier my debit card to cover the $50 tasting fee. The machine processed the transaction, humming softly before emitting a harsh, flat beep. The screen flashed bright red. Declined. I checked my banking app while walking back to my car, feeling the familiar, suffocating grip of poverty tightening around my ribs. My checking account was overdrawn by $12. I had meticulously budgeted every cent, but the automatic deduction from my electric bill had hit a day early, wiping out my remaining funds. I sat in the driver's seat of my repaired sedan, staring at the negative balance. I was routing multi-million-dollar freight shipments during the day, and I could not afford a box of cupcakes in the evening. The crisis escalated when I arrived at my parents' house to deliver the samples. The kitchen smelled of expensive candles and anxiety. Karen was pacing the hardwood floor, her phone pressed tightly against her ear, speaking in sharp-clipped tones to the catering director. "I understand the invoice deadline, but we are waiting on a substantial estate transfer," my mother argued, her voice tightening with desperation. "I am good for the deposit, I just need a 48-hour extension." She ended the call, slamming the phone down onto the granite island. The polished suburban veneer was gone, replaced by raw, frantic panic. Corporate event planners did not care about unnotarized wills or neighborhood status. They cared about cleared funds. Karen turned to me, her eyes locking onto my face with a terrifying intensity. "Nina, we have a problem," she announced, her tone abruptly shifting from panic to authoritative command. "The caterer is refusing to load the trucks for the party next week without the final $3,000 deposit. Your father's commission check does not clear until the end of the month, and I have tied up the rest of our liquid cash in the floral arrangements." I set the bakery boxes down on the counter, keeping my expression neutral. "Okay, what do you want me to do about it?" "I need you to put the catering deposit on your credit card," Karen stated as casually as if she were asking me to pass the salt. "We will reimburse you the moment Vivian's estate pays out. It is just a temporary hold." I looked at my mother, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her request. She was standing in a massive suburban kitchen, surrounded by luxury appliances, demanding that her financially strained daughter subsidize an extravagant party for the sister who had literally stolen my inheritance. "I cannot do that, Mom," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through my system. "My card is completely maxed out. I told you I had to replace the transmission in my car 3 weeks ago. I do not have $3,000 of available credit." Karen's eyes narrowed. The request instantly morphed into an accusation. "Then open a new one." "Nina," she snapped, stepping closer, her voice dripping with cruel dismissiveness. "Stop being so helpless. You are 26 years old and you have a corporate job. Go online, fill out an application, and get a new card. It takes 5 minutes." I stared at her, the reality of the situation settling heavily over my shoulders. She was not just asking for a favor. She was demanding that I take on high-interest debt to fund an illusion of wealth she could not maintain. She was attempting to leverage my credit score to protect her social standing. "Mom, I am not opening a new credit card to pay for Alyssa's engagement party," I said, drawing a firm, impenetrable boundary. "I am broke. I am living paycheck to paycheck because I had to fix my car, which Dad refused to help me with because he was too busy funding Alyssa's vacation. I am not financing this event." The kitchen went dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. Karen's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The mask completely shattered, revealing the vicious, manipulative core she usually kept hidden behind her practiced smiles. She leaned over the granite island, bringing her face inches from mine, and lowered her voice to a venomous whisper. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat." Karen hissed her words laced with absolute malice. "I have spent the last month letting you pretend you are an important part of this family, letting you organize this party so you could feel useful. But do not forget your place. You are nothing without this family. You are a glorified secretary who routes trucks. Alyssa is the one building a brand. Alyssa is the one marrying well." I did not flinch. I held her gaze, feeling the cool, solid weight of the secret locked inside the brass box anchoring me to the floor. "If you do not step up and be a sister right now," Karen continued, the threat escalating rapidly, "I will uninvite you from that party. I will cut you out of this family entirely. And I will make sure every single aunt, uncle, and cousin we have knows exactly why. I will tell them you tried to sabotage Alyssa's big day out of pure, bitter jealousy. I will ruin whatever pathetic reputation you think you have left. The threat was clear. It was the nuclear option. She was leveraging total social exile and a coordinated smear campaign to extort $3,000 from me. David walked into the kitchen, pausing by the refrigerator. He heard the threat. He saw his wife cornering his younger daughter, attempting to coerce her into debt. He did nothing. He grabbed the sparkling water, unscrewed the cap, and walked right back out of the room, silently endorsing the extortion. In that precise moment, a profound internal shift occurred. The lingering, desperate hope that I could ever win their love or respect died completely. It did not die with a bang, but with a quiet, finalized exhalation. I realized that to this family, my only value was as a resource to be consumed. I was not a daughter. I was a credit line. I was free labor. I was the scapegoat required to balance their toxic ecosystem. And if that was my designated role, I was finally ready to play the villain. I stood up straight, towering slightly over my mother. I did not yell. I did not cry. I channeled the cold, pragmatic authority I used when dealing with hostile freight vendors. I am not paying for the caterer, I said, my voice echoing clearly in the silent kitchen. If that means I am cut out of the family, then that is your choice. But I am done funding your delusions. Karen's mouth opened, shock radiating across her features. She was accustomed to my submission. She expected me to fold under the threat of public humiliation just like I always had. She did not know how to process a flat, uncompromising refusal. "You will regret this, Nina," she whispered, her voice shaking with rage. "You are going to be completely alone." I picked up my keys from the counter. "I am already alone, Mom," I replied, turning my back on her. "You just made it official." I walked out the front door, the heavy oak slamming shut behind me, severing the final tether holding me to that house. I drove back to my apartment, my mind racing through the logistical implications of the upcoming week. The engagement party was still scheduled. The guests were still coming. The caterer was still unpaid. The trap my grandmother had set was armed and ready to spring, and my mother was currently standing directly on the pressure plate, completely unaware of the devastation about to be unleashed. The public smear campaign Karen promised was inevitable, but I knew exactly how to endure it. I would attend that party. I would stand by the kitchen doors. I would let them take the shiny things. Because the lawyer's summons was already in the mail, and the real reckoning was less than a week away. The opulent ballroom of the Oak Creek Country Club smelled of roasted tenderloin and the crisp, expensive scent of imported white orchids. Those were the exact floral arrangements that had pushed the budget over the brink, the same flowers my mother had tried to force onto my maxed-out credit card. Now they cascaded down the center of 12 circular tables, surrounded by 50 guests wearing tailored suits and shimmering evening gowns. I stood in the sweltering heat of the industrial catering kitchen, wearing a simple black blazer and sensible flat shoes. The contrast between the lavish dining room and the chaotic stainless steel workspace behind the swinging doors was jarring. Out there, Alyssa and Chad were floating from table to table, accepting congratulations and posing for photographs. In here, a crisis was unfolding that threatened to derail the entire evening. My phone vibrated against my hip. It was not a text from my mother checking on my well-being. It was a frantic call from Thomas, the head catering manager. He stood 3 feet away from me near the loading dock, gripping his own phone, his face glistening with anxious sweat. "The main entree truck is gone," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a panicked whisper. The driver missed the exit off Interstate 70. He is stuck behind a major traffic collision and the highway patrol has shut down all eastbound lanes. The cocktail hour ends in 20 minutes. If that truck does not arrive, I have no dinner to serve your family. I did not panic. Panic was a luxury reserved for people who had a safety net. I dealt with stranded commercial vehicles every single day at the logistics terminal. A lost catering van was just a miniaturized version of a derailed freight shipment. I pulled out my phone and accessed the State Department of Transportation live traffic feeds. I pinpointed the exact location of the collision and the current position of the catering truck. The driver was trapped in a gridlock surrounded by concrete barriers. "Give me his direct number," I told Thomas, pulling a pen from my pocket and writing a sequence of route numbers on my clipboard. I dialed the driver. A highly stressed voice answered on the second ring. I introduced myself, maintaining the calm, authoritative tone I used with hostile cross-country dispatchers. "Listen carefully," I instructed, tracking his GPS coordinates on my screen. "You cannot stay on the interstate. You are going to take the emergency access ramp on your right, the one designated for maintenance vehicles. I have already checked the clearance. Your van will fit. Once you clear the barrier, take an immediate left onto Riverside Drive. There is a residential detour that bypasses the highway closure, but you have to avoid the stone bridge on Main Street because your roof is too high. Route through the commercial district on High Street and take the rear service entrance into the country club. You have 14 minutes. I stayed on the line, guiding the heavy vehicle turn by turn through the suburban back streets of Columbus. I navigated him away from low-hanging power lines and sharp, narrow intersections. I watched the digital clock on the wall tick down, measuring the remaining seconds of the cocktail hour. Just as the string quartet finished their final set in the ballroom, the heavy metal doors of the loading dock rattled open. The catering van backed into the bay, the engine hissing softly. Thomas nearly collapsed with relief. The kitchen staff sprang into action, unloading the insulated warming cabinets with practiced efficiency. The crisis was averted. The dinner service commenced smoothly. The guests sliced into their perfectly cooked meals, praising the quality of the food and the elegance of the evening. Nobody in that dining room knew they were eating because I had orchestrated a logistical miracle from a sweaty, windowless kitchen. I stood by the swinging doors, a glass of tap water in my hand, watching the event unfold. I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. I had protected the family from a humiliating disaster. I thought naively that perhaps my competence would earn a brief moment of quiet respect. Then the toasts began. The microphone emitted a sharp, high-pitched whine before my mother tapped the metal mesh with her fingernail. Karen stood at the head table, the crystal chandeliers illuminating her ivory suit. The room quieted, turning their attention to the matriarch. She offered a touching, rehearsed monologue about how much Alyssa deserved this fairy tale. She praised Chad, welcoming him into their prestigious fold, and then her gaze drifted toward the back of the room, locking onto the small rectangular window of the kitchen doors where I stood in the shadows. "And we must give a special thanks to our dear Nina Karen," announced, her voice dripping with a sugary sweetness that coated the venom underneath. She tried her very best to manage the catering budget today, bless her heart. We only ran out of the good champagne twice, but we all know math is not her strong suit. The room erupted into polite, rippling laughter. The sound hit me like a physical blow. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the statement stole the breath from my lungs. I had just saved her entire reputation. I had navigated a crisis that would have ruined the very event she was currently hosting. Yet her instinct was not gratitude. Her instinct was to serve me up as a public punchline to elevate her favorite child. My father chuckled softly from his seat, sipping his wine, perfectly content to watch his younger daughter be humiliated. Alyssa covered her mouth, letting the vintage emerald ring on her left index finger catch the light. The heirloom that belonged to me flashed brilliantly, a shining symbol of their collective theft. The injustice burned like acid in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling the familiar urge to defend myself rising in my chest. I wanted to push through those swinging doors, grab that microphone, and tell 50 wealthy guests exactly how close they came to starving tonight. I wanted to expose my mother for the fraud she was. But I stopped. I opened my eyes and looked at the green stone sparkling on my sister's hand. I remembered the heavy brass lockbox hidden beneath the false bottom of the oak desk. I remembered the thick stack of commercial deeds, the LLC paperwork, and the staggering wealth sitting quietly on a highway junction. And I remembered the handwritten note. They will try to take what shines, Nina. Let them. Wait for Thorn. My mother was not mocking me because I was incompetent. She was mocking me because my competence threatened her narrative. If I was capable, intelligent, and useful, she could no longer justify treating me like a disposable asset. She needed me to be a failure so she could feel successful. The anger evaporated, replaced by a profound, chilling clarity. They were laughing at a ghost. The daughter they thought they were insulting did not exist anymore. I set my glass of water down on a stainless steel prep table. I placed my clipboard neatly beside it, leaving my notes and routing schedules behind. I did not say goodbye to the catering staff. I did not push through the doors to make a dramatic exit. I simply turned around, walked down the concrete hallway, and pushed through the heavy exit doors leading into the parking lot. The cold Ohio night air hit my face crisp and refreshing. I walked across the dark asphalt, locating my 10-year-old sedan parked far away from the luxury vehicles near the valet stand. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the country club gates. I drove through the quiet suburban streets, leaving the laughter and the stolen emerald behind me. The silence in the car felt different tonight. It did not feel like social exile. It felt like preparation. I knew the legal gears were already turning downtown. I knew the letters were being drafted on heavy, expensive stationery. My family had just enjoyed their final celebration, completely oblivious to the fact that attorney Mitchell Thorne was about to drag them all into the harsh, unforgiving light of day. 72 hours after I walked out of the country club parking lot, a sharp knock echoed through my small apartment. I opened the door to find a postal carrier holding an electronic signature pad and a stiff cream-colored envelope. I signed my name, thanking him, and carried the parcel to my cramped kitchen table. The paper was thick, textured, and sealed with an unyielding adhesive. The return address in the upper left corner featured an embossed logo: Mitchell Thorne, attorney at law, accompanied by a suite number located in one of the sleek mirrored high-rises anchoring downtown Columbus. The gears my grandmother set in motion years ago had officially engaged. Before I could even locate a letter opener, my phone buzzed against the Formica counter. The screen lit up with a group text message from my mother. The tone of her digital communication radiated a frantic, unrestrained euphoria. The estate lawyer just sent the official summons, Karen wrote. We are meeting him tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp. Nina, please try to wear something presentable. Do not show up in your warehouse clothes. I made reservations at the Pearl for 11:30, so we can celebrate over mimosas after the paperwork is filed. I set the phone down next to the unopened envelope. She was planning a victory brunch. My mother firmly believed the unnotarized, decade-old scrap of paper she found in Vivian's nightstand was the ultimate trump card. She thought she was walking into a routine administrative handshake, ready to collect a fortune that would fund Alyssa's lavish lifestyle and secure her own suburban prestige. She had no idea the ground she was standing on was about to dissolve. The following morning, a crisp Ohio chill hung in the air. I drove my recently repaired sedan into the heart of the city, navigating the crowded streets near the state capitol. I parked in a subterranean garage and took the stairs to the street level, pulling the lapels of my dark navy blazer tight against the wind. It was the same practical, structured jacket I wore to executive logistics meetings at the freight terminal. It was designed for utility, not fashion. I entered the towering glass atrium of the law firm's building. The lobby smelled of rich espresso and expensive floor wax. I spotted my family standing near the bank of polished steel elevators. They looked like they were styled for a magazine editorial on generational wealth. Karen wore a camel hair coat draped over her shoulders, holding a designer leather tote bag tight against her side. I knew exactly what she kept inside that bag. The fake will was tucked safely in a folder, ready to be deployed the moment anyone questioned her authority. Alyssa stood next to her, checking her reflection in the dark glass of the elevator doors. She wore a tailored cream pantsuit, and the vintage emerald ring flashed on her right hand as she adjusted her hair. David stood a few feet away, responding to emails on his phone, treating the morning as a minor delay in his otherwise important sales schedule. "Ah, you made it," Karen noted as I approached. She surveyed my outfit, her lips pressing into a thin line of mild disappointment. "Well, at least it is clean. Just follow our lead upstairs, Nina. Do not interrupt Mr. Thorne while he is speaking. Estate law is complicated, and we want to get through this quickly." I offered a single, compliant nod. I did not say a word as the elevator doors chimed and slid open. We rode up to the 40th floor in silence. The ascent made my ears pop, taking us high above the industrial sectors and shipping lanes I managed every day. The receptionist on the 40th floor guided us down a hushed, carpeted hallway lined with framed modern art. She pushed open a set of heavy mahogany doors, revealing a sprawling corner conference room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the Scioto River and the dense urban grid of Columbus. A long table, crafted from polished walnut, dominated the space, surrounded by plush leather executive chairs. Karen immediately claimed the seat at the head of the table, a position usually reserved for the presiding attorney. She gestured for Alyssa to sit directly to her right, smoothing her eldest daughter's collar with a maternal, triumphant pat. David took the seat to her left, placing his phone face up on the table. I walked past them, choosing a chair at the extreme far end of the long walnut table. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. 2 minutes later, the side door of the office opened. Attorney Mitchell Thorne walked into the room. He was a man in his late 60s, possessing the sharp, unyielding posture of someone who had spent decades dismantling opposing counsel. His silver hair was impeccably groomed, and he wore a dark charcoal suit that fit with precise custom measurements. He carried a thick leather portfolio under one arm. Thorne stopped at the edge of the table, his piercing blue eyes evaluating the seating arrangement. He registered Karen sitting in his chair, but his expression did not change. He simply moved to the opposite end of the room, taking the seat adjacent to mine. "Good morning," Thorne said, his voice deep and resonant, echoing slightly against the glass windows. "I am Mitchell Thorne. I was Vivian Reynolds' primary legal counsel for the last 15 years." Karen offered a bright, overly familiar smile. "It is wonderful to finally meet you, Mitchell. I am Karen Vivian's daughter. This is my husband, David, and my girls, Alyssa and Nina. We are so glad you reached out. I actually have some documents in my bag that will expedite this entire process for you." She patted her designer tote, signaling her readiness to hand over the unnotarized draft. Thorne placed his leather portfolio on the table. He did not reach for her bag. "I have all the necessary documentation right here, Mrs. Stevens," he replied, his tone polite but laced with a frigid professionalism. "Let us just cut right to the chase, shall we?" Karen insisted, tapping her manicured nails against the wood. "We have brunch reservations across town in an hour. We all know how these things go. The house is being sold, the accounts need to be transferred to my name, and we want to get the probate clock ticking. Just point to where I need to sign. David checked his silver wristwatch, reinforcing his wife's impatience. We really do have a tight schedule today, Counselor. Thorne slowly unclasped the brass buckles of his portfolio. He did not rush. He did not accommodate their urgency. He operated on his own timeline, projecting an authority that made the air in the room feel heavy and restricted. He opened the leather cover, revealing a pristine stack of thick, watermarked parchment paper. I watched my mother lean forward, her eyes locked onto the documents, hungry for the validation she believed was imminent. Alyssa mirrored the posture, gently turning her right hand so the stolen emerald caught the natural sunlight pouring through the windows. They were vibrating with unearned confidence, entirely oblivious to the lethal snare hidden beneath the attorney's calm demeanor. Thorne smoothed his hand over the top page. Before he began to read, his gaze drifted down the length of the table. He bypassed Karen. He ignored David. His eyes locked onto mine. For a fraction of a second, the severe lines around his mouth softened. He offered a microscopic dip of his chin, a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of recognition. It was a silent confirmation that he knew exactly who I was, and more importantly, he knew exactly what was about to happen. I held his gaze, keeping my face perfectly still. My pulse settled into a slow, steady rhythm. The bait was laid. The audience was seated. The false narrative my mother had spent her entire life building was resting on the executioner's block, waiting for the blade to fall. Thorne adjusted his reading glasses, cleared his throat, and looked directly at my mother. "We will not be requiring your signatures today," Mrs. Stevens Thorne stated, his voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "Because the execution of this estate does not require your permission." The air in the 40th floor conference room stalled. Karen froze her bright, demanding smile, cracking at the edges. For a woman who meticulously engineered every social interaction to guarantee her own dominance, being told her permission was irrelevant felt like a physical slap. She blinked rapidly, trying to process the attorney's blunt dismissal. David shifted in his plush leather executive chair, leaning forward to deploy his corporate sales tactics. He attempted to project an easy, relatable charm, the kind he used to smooth over difficult pharmaceutical contracts. "Now, Mitchell, there is no need to be adversarial," my father reasoned, holding his palms up in a placating gesture. "We are all grieving here. We simply want to wrap up Vivian's affairs efficiently so we can move forward." The lawyer ignored the attempt at camaraderie. He did not return the smile. He focused entirely on the pristine stack of watermarked documents resting inside his leather portfolio. "We will proceed strictly according to the legal directives left by the deceased Thorne," stated his voice, devoid of any comforting warmth. He picked up the first document, adjusting his reading glasses. "According to the primary last will and testament, updated and filed shortly after the passing of her late husband Vivian Reynolds, dictates the handling of her primary residential property. The estate, located on Willow Creek Drive, is to be placed on the market immediately." He continued reading the standard boilerplate language regarding the hiring of estate liquidators, the clearing of municipal taxes, and the payment of outstanding utility balances. "Once the residential property is sold and all final debts associated with that specific address are settled, the remaining net proceeds are to be divided evenly into 2 equal disbursements. One half shall be awarded to David Stevens, and the other half shall go to Karen Stevens." A profound, visible wave of relief washed over my mother. The tension drained from her shoulders, and her posture relaxed back into a state of arrogant triumph. She shot a glowing, victorious glance at Alyssa. I could practically see the mental calculations running behind her eyes already, spending the real estate payout on ice sculptures, premium open bars, and designer bridal gowns. My parents possessed a fundamental obsession with liquid cash. They built their entire suburban existence on the illusion of immediate wealth, prioritizing luxury car leases and country club dues over sustainable investments. A lump sum from a house sale was the exact influx of capital they craved to maintain their crumbling facade. In their minds, they had just won the lottery. They believed the transaction was complete. "That is wonderful news," Karen beamed, her voice dripping with renewed saccharine sweetness. "The housing market in that neighborhood is highly competitive right now. We anticipate a very quick turnaround. I will contact our preferred realtor this afternoon to get the listing activated." Thorne finished reciting the section regarding the suburban colonial. He closed the first folder and set it aside on the polished walnut table. He did not offer a pen for signatures. He did not congratulate them on their windfall. Instead, he reached into a secondary compartment of his portfolio. The sound of heavy parchment paper rustling cut through the quiet room. It sounded entirely different from the standard printer paper of the first will. It was thicker, stiffer, carrying the distinct auditory weight of something permanent and binding. The attorney deliberately removed his reading glasses, letting them dangle from a thin silver chain around his neck. He looked at my mother, his expression hardening into something resembling absolute zero. "That concludes the directives regarding the physical residence," Thorne announced, folding his hands over the new stack of parchment. "We will now address the secondary legal instrument filed by your mother 3 years ago." Karen noticed the shift in his tone. The triumphant glow on her face flickered. She reached swiftly into her designer leather tote bag, pulling out the folded, unnotarized draft she had scavenged from the dusty nightstand. "Wait, I actually have her final wishes right here," my mother interjected, waving the flimsy sheet of paper like a shield. "I found this in her bedroom. It clearly states she intended to leave everything entirely under my control. You do not need to complicate things with outdated secondary files." Thorne did not even glance at the paper trembling in her hand. "Any informal drafts, handwritten notes, or unnotarized expressions of intent found inside the residence are rendered completely void," he explained with surgical, devastating precision. "The documents I hold are officially registered, fully notarized, and legally impenetrable. You may put that away, Mrs. Stevens. It has zero legal standing in this office." David's jaw tightened. His salesman charm completely evaporated, replaced by a rigid defensive posture. "What exactly is a secondary legal instrument?" he demanded, dropping the friendly first-name basis. "It is a binding, irrevocable trust codicil," Thorne answered, placing his glasses back onto the bridge of his nose. "This instrument bypasses standard probate courts entirely. It dictates the distribution of Vivian's personal effects, her hidden financial portfolios, and her commercial assets. It cannot be contested, it cannot be altered, and it cannot be delayed by anyone sitting at this table." The mention of hidden portfolios and commercial assets caused a severe atmospheric shift inside the conference room. Alyssa stopped admiring the sparkle of the stolen heirloom on her finger. She looked around, suddenly confused by the introduction of terms that did not align with her mother's promised fairy tale. Thorne began to read from the heavy parchment. The language was drastically different from the standard legal jargon of the initial will. It sounded exactly like my grandmother. It was sharp, unsparing, and fiercely perceptive. "I, Vivian Reynolds, being of sound mind and absolute clarity, do hereby append this codicil to my estate Thorne," recited, his voice carrying the full, unyielding weight of the deceased matriarch. "I have spent the final decades of my life observing the character and actions of my immediate family. I have witnessed a distinct toxic pattern of behavior wherein resources are consistently diverted away from the deserving in order to subsidize the entitled." I sat perfectly still at the far end of the walnut table. The validation washed over me, a quiet, profound vindication settling deep into my bones. Vivian had seen everything. She saw the favoritism, the extortion, and the relentless emotional manipulation. Karen opened her mouth to protest, her face flushing with indignation, but the lawyer raised a single authoritative finger, silencing her instantly. He continued reading the clause, articulating every syllable so the impact could not possibly be misunderstood or ignored. "It is my explicit desire to protect the true value of my life's work from those who would squander it on superficial vanity," Thorne read aloud, staring directly at my mother. "Therefore, because my daughter cannot be trusted to distribute my legacy fairly, I have secured it where she cannot reach it." The legal hammer dropped, shattering the suburban illusion into 1,000 jagged pieces. The color drained entirely from Karen's face. The flush of victory was instantly replaced by an ashen, horrified pallor. She looked as though the floor beneath her expensive designer heels had suddenly opened, plunging her into a terrifying freefall. Her mouth hung slightly open, unable to form a coherent response to being so thoroughly and officially condemned by her own mother in a corporate legal setting. The silence following the quote was absolute. The background hum of the city traffic far below the 40th floor windows seemed to vanish. Alyssa looked at her mother, her eyes wide with rising panic, waiting for Karen to fix the situation, to manipulate the rules to somehow regain control of the narrative like she always managed to do. But Karen was paralyzed. The invincible queen of the neighborhood association had been completely outmaneuvered by an elderly woman she wrongly assumed was just a clueless pensioner living in a decaying house. The foundational lie of her entire existence had been exposed on heavy, watermarked parchment. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, maintaining a neutral, professional expression. The chaotic panic engulfing my parents was a stark contrast to the steady, calculated calm anchoring my chest. The first layer of the trap had successfully sprung, immobilizing the predators. However, the reading was far from over. The attorney was merely setting the stage for the true devastation. Thorne flipped to the next page of the irrevocable trust. His piercing blue eyes moved away from the shattered, speechless matriarch and locked directly onto the eldest daughter, sitting frozen in her tailored cream pantsuit. "Before we discuss the transfer of the commercial real estate and the hidden financial holdings," Thorne stated, his tone dropping an octave, becoming dangerously severe, "there is a strict, immediate condition regarding a specific piece of personal property. A condition that carries severe financial penalties for the entire family if it is not rectified in this room right now." The silence in the conference room stretched thin, taut as wire before Attorney Mitchell Thorne broke it. He did not raise his voice. He simply leaned slightly forward, fixing his gaze on my sister. "We will now address the vintage emerald ring," Thorne stated. "The piece originally purchased by the late Arthur Reynolds in 1962. Alyssa flinched. The rehearsed poise she wore like a second skin vanished. She pulled her right hand off the mahogany table, crossing her arms tightly across her chest, as if she could physically shield the stolen heirloom from the legal proceeding. Karen, still reeling from the revelation of the trust codicil, snapped her attention toward the lawyer, her survival instincts kicking in. "That ring is a family matter," Karen argued, her voice high and thin, lacking its usual authoritative resonance. "It is not part of this estate discussion. My mother gave it to Alyssa before she passed. It was a verbal gift. A grandmother passing down a keepsake to her eldest granddaughter." Thorne did not blink. He flipped to the third page of the heavy parchment document. "A verbal gift holds no legal weight when it directly contradicts a registered binding trust." Thorne corrected his tone, dismissive. And Vivian was incredibly specific regarding this particular asset. He cleared his throat and read directly from the page. "The vintage square-cut emerald ring held in my personal possession is bequeathed solely and irrevocably to my granddaughter, Nina Stevens. I am aware of the historical pattern within my family regarding the redirection of assets. Therefore, I mandate that this piece be transferred directly to Nina. If the ring is in the possession of anyone else at the time of this reading, it must be surrendered immediately, under penalty of estate forfeiture. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. The words hung suspended over the polished walnut table, heavy and uncompromising. Alyssa stared at Thorne, her perfectly contoured face contorting into a mask of pure disbelief. She looked down at the green stone sparkling against her knuckle, then turned to her mother for a rescue that was fundamentally impossible. "Mom, tell him," Alyssa pleaded, her voice cracking. "She gave it to me. You said she wanted me to have it because of my upcoming wedding. It is mine." Karen reached out, placing a trembling hand on Alyssa's arm. "Mitchell, this is ridiculous. You cannot force a young woman to hand over a sentimental piece of jewelry in the middle of a law office. We are already dealing with the shock of this hidden trust. Can we please just settle the house sale first and discuss the ring later?" Thorne slowly removed his reading glasses, letting them drop against his chest. He folded his hands over the trust documents, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying calm. "We are not discussing anything, Mrs. Stevens," Thorne stated, his voice dropping into a register that commanded complete silence. "We are executing a legal mandate. The trust clearly stipulates that the ring must be surrendered immediately." Alyssa shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. The tears were real this time, driven by panic rather than performance. "No," she cried, clutching her right hand tightly with her left. "I am not taking it off. It is my engagement piece. My followers already know it is mine. You cannot just take it away from me." The mention of her social media followers in a high-stakes legal meeting was absurd, yet perfectly aligned with Alyssa's distorted reality. She believed her digital narrative carried more weight than notarized legal documents. Thorne leaned back in his leather chair. The cold professionalism morphed into something sharper, something distinctly adversarial. He was no longer just reading a document. He was actively dismantling their defiance. "Let me clarify your current position," Miss Stevens Thorne said, addressing Alyssa directly. "That ring is cataloged as a protected asset within this irrevocable trust. It has been appraised and documented. Because you are not the designated beneficiary, your current possession of that item is not recognized as a gift. Under the laws of the state of Ohio, it is classified as theft." The word theft echoed through the room, brutal and undeniable. David finally spoke, his face pale, realizing the severe legal jeopardy his wife and daughter had blindly wandered into. "Now hold on, Mitchell. Nobody stole anything. It was a misunderstanding." "It is grand larceny," David Thorne countered, instantly shutting down the attempted defense. "And if your daughter attempts to leave this building with that protected asset on her finger, I will have no choice but to immediately contact the Columbus Police Department and file a formal criminal report on behalf of the estate." Alyssa gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. Furthermore, Thorne continued, ensuring the trap was completely sealed. "The trust explicitly states that failure to surrender the ring immediately results in total estate forfeiture. If you refuse to hand it over right now, I will file an emergency injunction freezing the sale of the residential property. The funds you are expecting from the house will be locked indefinitely, and they will be drained to cover the legal fees required to prosecute you for the theft of the ring." The silence that followed was suffocating. The lawyer had just outlined the exact cost of their arrogance. "My parents had leveraged their entire financial future on the immediate sale of Vivian's decaying colonial. They needed that cash injection to survive the mountain of debt they had accrued planning Alyssa's lavish engagement party and upcoming wedding. Thorne was offering them a stark, unforgiving choice. They could keep the ring and face criminal charges while losing the house payout, or they could surrender the stolen heirloom and salvage their only remaining lifeline. Karen understood the math. The arrogant matriarch who had commanded the country club ballroom just 3 nights ago was now utterly powerless, trapped by the precise legal mechanisms her mother had established. Karen turned to Alyssa. Her eyes were wide, filled with a frantic, desperate urgency. "Take it off, Alyssa. Mom, no." Alyssa sobbed, her manicured nails digging into her own skin. "Take it off, right now," Karen hissed, her voice sharp and commanding, prioritizing her own financial survival over her daughter's vanity. "We cannot lose the house money. Just give it back to her." Alyssa looked at her father. David stared at the polished walnut table, refusing to make eye contact, silently endorsing his wife's command. The golden child was finally experiencing the cold, transactional reality of our family dynamic. When the pressure became too intense, she was just as expendable as I was. Trembling visibly, Alyssa slowly uncurled her fingers. She reached for the vintage band with her left hand. The metal scraped audibly against her knuckle as she pulled it free. She did not hand it to me. She refused to acknowledge my presence at the far end of the table. Instead, she dropped the ring directly onto the wood in front of her. The heavy, metallic clack of the gold hitting the polished mahogany sounded like a gavel striking a sound block. It was the sound of finality, the sound of a false narrative shattering completely. I stood up from my chair. I walked the length of the long conference table, the silence in the room so profound I could hear the fabric of my practical navy blazer shifting against my shirt. I stopped beside my sister. She was weeping quietly, staring at the floor, stripped of her stolen prize. I reached down and picked up the emerald. The gold was still warm from her skin. I held the ring for a moment, examining the deep green stone. The jardine, the intricate network of internal flaws that made the gem so resilient, caught the natural light pouring through the 40th floor windows. It was tough. It had survived immense pressure, just like my grandmother, just like me. I looked down at my sister, then at my mother, who was watching me with a mixture of terror and defeated rage. "Thank you," I said. My voice was completely devoid of emotion. It was flat, clinical, and precise. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice or demand an apology. The raw power of the moment resided entirely in the cold, undeniable fact that they had been forced to comply. I slipped the ring into the pocket of my blazer, returned to my seat at the far end of the table, and folded my hands neatly back into my lap. The first asset had been reclaimed. The stolen inheritance was back in my possession, but the ring was merely a pebble in the avalanche Vivian had prepared. The true devastation, the revelation that would permanently annihilate my family's perceived social hierarchy, was still hidden inside the attorney's leather portfolio. My mother released a jagged, uneven breath, attempting to manually restart her fractured composure. She adjusted her camel hair coat, pulling the expensive fabric tight across her shoulders, as if the garment could insulate her from the humiliation she had just witnessed. For a woman who carefully engineered every social interaction to guarantee her own dominance, watching her eldest daughter be forced to surrender stolen property under the threat of criminal prosecution was a staggering blow. However, Karen possessed a remarkable ability to compartmentalize defeat when cash was on the line. She swallowed her pride, fixing a stiff, artificial smile back onto her face. "Well," my mother said, her voice brittle and higher than usual, "now that this unpleasant distraction is resolved, we can get back to the primary agenda. The house on Willow Creek Drive. I assume we just need to sign the listing agreements and the probate authorizations so we can get the property on the market before the spring real estate rush?" She reached into her designer tote bag, pulling out a sterling silver pen, entirely desperate to finalize the residential sale and secure the funds she so desperately needed to cover the impending wedding vendor invoices. Attorney Mitchell Thorne did not look at her. He did not acknowledge the silver pen resting on the polished walnut table. He simply took the thin file containing the residential details and pushed it to the far corner of his desk, out of reach. "We are far from finished," Mrs. Stevens, the counselor, stated, his tone carrying the frigid, uncompromising weight of a judge delivering a verdict. "The residential property is a minor footnote in this estate. It represents a mere fraction of Vivian Reynolds' true net worth. We must now address the primary holding, governed by the irrevocable trust." My father shifted in his plush executive chair. David was a seasoned regional sales director. He spent his days analyzing market shares and negotiating pharmaceutical contracts. The phrase primary holding triggered an immediate instinctual reaction in him. The bored, impatient posture he had maintained all morning vanished. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he tried to calculate what his mother-in-law could have possibly hidden from them. Thorne unclasped the largest section of his leather portfolio. He extracted a thick, heavily bound stack of legal documents. The sheer volume of the paperwork indicated a level of financial complexity that went far beyond a simple suburban house sale. 25 years ago, Thorne began, his voice echoing cleanly off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. "Your mother foresaw the rapid expansion of the corporate logistics sector here in Ohio. She recognized that our state serves as a critical geographical bellwether, bridging the industrial manufacturing hubs of the Midwest with the heavy distribution corridors leading to the East Coast. Rather than invest in volatile stocks or superficial luxuries, she leveraged her savings to purchase raw, undeveloped land." Karen frowned, her grip tightening on the edge of the table. Land. What land? She lived in that decaying colonial her entire life. She clipped coupons. She weaponized your assumptions against you, the lawyer replied smoothly, not bothering to hide his disdain. She formed a private holding company to manage her acquisitions anonymously. Thorne turned the top page of the thick stack, adjusting his reading glasses. "I present the official incorporation and asset registry for Greenstone Holdings, LLC," he announced. "The sole proprietor and managing director of this entity was Vivian Reynolds." The name hung in the air, echoing the vintage emerald resting safely inside my blazer pocket. Greenstone. I felt my pulse steady into a calm, rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. I knew this name. I had seen the logo emblazoned on the massive commercial signage during my miserable, freezing morning commutes. "The primary asset under this LLC," Thorne continued reading the legal descriptions with meticulous precision, "consists of 200 continuous acres of commercial real estate, located directly adjacent to the interstate highway junction. It is zoned exclusively for heavy industrial freight and corporate supply chain distribution." David inhaled sharply. The sound was audible across the quiet conference room. A profound realization washed over my father's face, draining the color from his cheeks. As a businessman who navigated Ohio's corporate infrastructure daily, he grasped the staggering geographical value of that specific location. That highway junction was the beating heart of the regional economy. It was the central artery where millions of tons of cargo transitioned from long-haul trucks to local delivery fleets. "That is prime industrial zoning," David whispered, almost talking to himself, his salesman brain struggling to comprehend the scale of the revelation. "That acreage is worth tens of millions. It is valued significantly higher than that," Mr. Stevens Thorne corrected without looking up from the pages, "especially considering the land is not sitting idle. The acreage is fully developed into a premier logistics park featuring customized cross-dock facilities, fulfillment warehouses, and high-capacity freight bays. The attorney flipped to the next section of the binder. Greenstone Holdings does not operate the facilities, he clarified. The LLC operates strictly as the commercial landlord. The property is currently bound by 99-year triple net commercial leases to 3 major national freight operators. These tenants are responsible for all property taxes, structural maintenance, and insurance premiums. The holding company simply collects the rent. Thorne began listing the active corporate tenants occupying the land. He named a global shipping conglomerate first, followed by a major automotive parts distributor. Then he read the third name on the lease registry. Midwest Central Logistics, the lawyer stated. The breath caught in my throat. I blinked, staring at the polished wood grain of the table to maintain my stoic facade. Midwest Central Logistics was my employer. It was the exact firm where I spent 50 hours a week orchestrating supply chains, fighting with hostile vendors, and eating cold turkey sandwiches at my desk. My grueling, exhausting commute on the public transit bus had forced me to ride past that sprawling industrial park every single morning while my car was broken. I had stared out the frost-covered windows, watching the semi-trucks idle at the loading bays, unaware that I was looking at my own inheritance. My grandmother owned the concrete beneath my corporate office. She owned the terminal where I worked. The sheer, undeniable irony of the situation was a masterpiece of poetic justice. I was sitting in a high-rise law firm, listening to an attorney confirm that the grueling corporate grind my mother constantly belittled was taking place on property my family secretly controlled. I was not just inheriting an exorbitant passive income stream. I was inheriting the ground my demanding bosses stood on. I was about to become their landlord. Karen shook her head, a frantic, disjointed movement. She could not process the paradigm shift. Her reality was fracturing too quickly for her to build a new defensive narrative. This is impossible, my mother stammered, her voice cracking under the weight of her own ignorance. She never told us. She never gave us a single dime of that revenue. If she had this kind of wealth, why did she let us struggle to pay for Alyssa's college? Why did she let me drive a leased sedan when she could have bought us a country club estate? Because she saw exactly what you valued, Thorne replied, delivering the final unsparing truth. She watched you prioritize status over substance. She knew that handing you this level of commercial power would only fuel your vanity and destroy any chance of character development in your children. She protected the empire by hiding it from you. The attorney closed the heavy binder. He placed his hands flat on top of the leather cover, shifting his gaze down the length of the long table, bypassing the hyperventilating matriarch, the paralyzed salesman, and the weeping golden child. His eyes locked onto mine. Vivian was incredibly specific regarding the succession of Greenstone Holdings, the counselor announced. The trust dictates that the entirety of the LLC, including all 200 acres of commercial land, all existing tenant lease agreements, and all accumulated capital resting in the corporate holding accounts, is to be transferred immediately and irrevocably to a single beneficiary. Thorne picked up the thick, heavy folder of commercial deeds. He did not hand it to Karen. He did not pass it to David. He slid the massive stack of paperwork across the smooth walnut surface. The folder glided with a soft, weighted friction, stopping precisely in front of my folded hands. To Nina Stevens, Thorne concluded, his voice echoing with profound finality. My father released a ragged, audible gasp, sinking back into his chair as if all the oxygen had been vacuumed from the room. The undisputed reality of the power dynamic settled over the conference table, crushing my family's perceived social hierarchy into dust. The daughter they had designated as the invisible workhorse, the scapegoat they had verbally abused and financially extorted just to fund a catering budget, was now a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate magnate. I placed my hand flat against the thick folder of deeds. The paper felt heavy, carrying the undeniable weight of decades of meticulous planning. I looked at my mother, watching her mind race as she realized the horrifying financial trap she had built for herself. She had signed high-end contracts for extravagant wedding vendors, banking entirely on an estate she was just permanently locked out of. The silent grind was over, and the reckoning for her vanity was standing right at her front door. The heavy cream-colored folder rested on the polished walnut table precisely 3 inches from my folded hands. The sound of David's ragged exhale still hung in the air, a physical manifestation of a family structure collapsing in real time. For 3 seconds, the 40th floor conference room existed in a state of suspended animation. Then the shock fractured, giving way to absolute unbridled chaos. Karen slammed both palms flat onto the mahogany table. The impact was loud, echoing sharply against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. She launched herself out of the executive leather chair, abandoning any pretense of suburban composure. "This is fraud!" Karen screamed, her voice tearing at the seams, devoid of its usual melodic, manufactured tone. "This is absolute fraud! You manipulated a dying woman, Nina! You went into that hospital room while we were giving her space, and you brainwashed her into signing these documents. I will contest this. I will take this to the Supreme Court if I have to." Attorney Mitchell Thorne did not stand. He did not match her volume. He simply steepled his fingers, radiating the terrifying patience of a predator watching prey exhaust itself against a steel cage. "You will do no such thing, Mrs. Stevens Thorne," corrected his voice, dropping into a deadly quiet register that commanded the room. This trust was established and executed 3 years prior to Vivian's passing. Your daughter, Nina, had zero knowledge of its existence, nor did she have any access to the legal filings. I know this because I am the one who drafted them. If you attempt to challenge the mental competency of your late mother, I will personally represent the estate in court, and I promise you, I will make the process excruciatingly expensive. Karen recoiled, her chest heaving. She looked at David, desperate for him to leverage his corporate authority to step in and bully the lawyer into submission. But David remained seated, staring blankly at the thick binder of commercial leases. The pharmaceutical sales director, a man who built his career on aggressive negotiation tactics, understood the impenetrable density of a triple-net corporate lease agreement. He knew Thorne had them completely cornered. Alyssa, realizing that the house money was officially frozen and the hidden empire was irrevocably transferred, abandoned the role of the indignant heiress. Her survival instinct pivoted instantly. The golden child, accustomed to having her vanity subsidized on demand, collapsed into the role of the desperate victim. She turned toward me, tears spilling over her lower lashes, dragging dark streaks of expensive mascara down her cheeks. "Nina, please," Alyssa begged, her voice cracking, reaching out with both hands as if to grab my blazer. "You cannot do this. Chad and I have already signed the contracts for the venue and the florist. The deposits are non-refundable. The catering bill alone is staggering. If we do not pay them by Friday, they are going to cancel the entire wedding." I looked at my older sister. I analyzed her the same way I analyzed a bottleneck at the logistics terminal. I isolated the emotion from the data. Alyssa was 29 years old. She possessed a college degree funded entirely by our parents, yet she refused to work a conventional job, preferring to chase the illusion of internet fame. She had spent the last month parading my stolen inheritance for digital applause, mocking my grueling work schedule and demanding I utilize my professional skills to plan her engagement party for free. Now she wanted access to the very wealth she had deemed me too clumsy and unworthy to handle. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I leaned forward, employing the exact pragmatic tone I used when dispatching freight routes across the Midwest. You signed those contracts, Alyssa, I stated clearly, ensuring every syllable carried the weight of finality. You authorized the spending based on an assumption of wealth you did not possess. You demanded I pay for your catering budget while actively wearing a ring my mother stole from me. Nina, we are sisters, she sobbed, clutching her hands to her chest. No, I corrected her. We are a transaction. You only acknowledge my existence when you need a resource. The answer is no. I am not funding your wedding. I am not bailing you out of the debt you accrued trying to impress a neighborhood association that does not care about you. Karen lunged forward, her face twisted in a mask of pure, vicious rage. You ungrateful, spiteful little brat! My mother hissed, completely abandoning the maternal facade. I gave you everything. I put a roof over your head. I clothed you. This is how you repay your family? By hoarding money that belongs to us? I stood up from my chair. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of fear. I was 26 years old. For 2 decades, I had shrunk myself to accommodate my mother's suffocating ego. I had absorbed her passive-aggressive insults, her financial extortion, and her relentless gaslighting. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life attempting to convince me I was invisible. You did not give me everything, Mom, I replied, my voice echoing off the glass walls. You gave everything to Alyssa. You gave me demands. You gave me ultimatums. You gave me the responsibility of cleaning up the messes you created. I placed my hand firmly on top of the commercial deed folder. Vivian saw exactly who you were, I continued, holding Karen's furious gaze. She saw that you viewed me as a utility, so she gave me the power to turn off the power. Karen's jaw trembled. She opened her mouth to launch another threat to promise the social ruin and total exile she had weaponized just days prior. I cut her off before she could draw breath. If you ever speak to me the way you did at that engagement party again, I warned, my tone dropping to a cold, razor-sharp edge, I will have Thorne bury you in audits. I will legally contest every single receipt associated with the sale of the Willow Creek property. I will tie up your half of that residential payout in probate court for the next 5 years. Do you understand me? The threat landed with devastating precision. My parents were drowning in high-interest credit card debt accumulated by funding Alyssa's influencer lifestyle and their own luxury car leases. The residential payout, the very money they were expecting to clear their balances and pay off the wedding vendors, was their only remaining lifeline. If I froze those assets, they would face total financial collapse. Karen understood the mathematics of the situation. The power dynamic, carefully maintained for 26 years, did not just shift. It shattered into unrecognizable fragments. My mother closed her mouth. She stepped back from the mahogany table, her shoulders slumping in absolute defeat. The invincible suburban matriarch had been stripped of her weapons. She had no leverage, no authority, and no financial control. I picked up the thick folder of commercial deeds. I tucked it neatly under my arm, adjusting the lapels of my practical navy blazer. I turned my attention back to the attorney, ignoring the weeping golden child and the paralyzed parents. Mr. Thorne, I said, maintaining my professional composure, I believe we have concluded the necessary disclosures for today. Indeed we have, Miss Stevens, the lawyer replied, offering a tight, satisfied nod. We have a few final transfer documents to process regarding the LLC, but I believe your family is officially excused from the remainder of this meeting. The dismissal was total. The antagonists were being actively removed from the narrative. The stage was cleared, leaving me alone with the legal architect to finalize the transition of power. My family was about to walk out of that high-rise building completely empty-handed, leaving me to claim an empire they never even knew existed. The heavy mahogany doors of the conference room closed with a solid, echoing thud, sealing my family out of the narrative. The silence that followed was profound. It was not the heavy, oppressive quiet of a suburban dining room after a shouting match. It was the clean, sterile silence of a corporate vacuum, where emotion held zero currency. Attorney Mitchell Thorne remained standing for a moment, listening to the muffled, frantic sounds of Karen and Alyssa arguing in the carpeted hallway as they waited for the elevator. He did not smile, but the severe lines around his mouth relaxed marginally. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, Miss Stevens." Thorne noted his voice returning to a normal conversational volume. She possessed a terrifying clarity regarding human nature. I kept my gaze fixed on the thick folder of commercial deeds resting in front of me. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady. She saw what everyone else refused to look at. Thorne pulled out his leather chair and sat down, opening a fresh file containing the final transfer documents for Greenstone Holdings, LLC. He uncapped a heavy Mont Blanc fountain pen. The gold nib caught the sunlight streaming through the 40th floor windows. "Before we finalize these signatures," Thorne began leaning forward, "there is a secondary legal reality regarding your family's current financial exposure that Vivienne explicitly asked me to explain to you. It concerns the liabilities they have recently acquired." I looked up the tactical side of my brain, immediately engaging. I managed supply chain risks for a living. I understood that every action created an equal and opposite logistical reaction. "What liabilities?" Thorne tapped the pen against his legal pad. He was not just an estate lawyer. He was an architect of consequence. "Your mother and sister have spent the last month operating under the assumption that the residential property sale would cover their immediate debts," the counselor explained. "As a result, they personally signed binding contracts with multiple high-end event vendors for the upcoming wedding. The country club, the premium caterer, the imported florists, they are all contractually guaranteed." I nodded, recalling the panicked kitchen conversation where my mother tried to force a $3,000 catering deposit onto my maxed-out credit card. "I know. They assumed probate would clear in time to cover the invoices." "Exactly," Thorne confirmed. "However, corporate event vendors do not operate on the promise of pending estate sales. They operate on signed guarantees. Because Karen and Alyssa signed those contracts in their own names, banking entirely on cash that is now irrevocably locked inside this commercial trust, they are personally liable for the full balances." The scope of the devastation crystallized in my mind. My parents were already drowning in consumer debt funding leased luxury vehicles and Alyssa's superficial lifestyle. They did not have the liquid capital to pay off tens of thousands of dollars in high-interest wedding contracts. "If they default on those payments," Thorne continued, his tone unsparing, "the vendors will immediately send the accounts to collections. The resulting judgments will likely force your parents to liquidate their own assets, potentially including their primary residence, simply to satisfy the debt. Vivienne understood that handing you the commercial trust would simultaneously spring a financial trap on them, one they built entirely by themselves. The payoff was absolute. Vivienne had not just protected her legacy, she had weaponized their arrogance. By letting them believe they had won the residential house, she encouraged them to spend recklessly, ensuring their vanity would be their ultimate ruin. I picked up the Mont Blanc pen Thorne offered. The gold felt heavy and substantial between my fingers. I did not feel pity. I did not feel the sudden urge to rescue them from the consequences of their own actions. I had spent my entire life acting as their shock absorber, bailing them out of logistical disasters while they mocked my competence. That dynamic was permanently severed. I flipped open the first transfer document. It detailed the full operational control of the 200 acres of prime Ohio commercial real estate. I scanned the terms, recognizing the complex clauses governing the triple net leases held by the national freight operators. This was my language. I understood zoning permits, highway access, and capacity management. I was not just inheriting wealth. I was inheriting an empire I was uniquely qualified to run. I signed my name on the dotted line. The ink flowed smoothly across the heavy parchment. We spent the next 45 minutes executing the transition of power. I signed bank authorizations, tax transfer forms, and LLC directorial amendments. With every signature, the wall separating me from my family's toxicity grew thicker and more impenetrable. I was systematically locking them out of my future. When the final document was countersigned and sealed with the official notary stamp, Thorne closed the binder. He pushed a sleek black leather folder containing my copies across the walnut table. "Congratulations, Miss Stevens," the attorney said, extending his hand. "You are now the sole managing director of Greenstone Holdings. I look forward to working with you." I shook his hand. His grip was firm, conveying a genuine professional respect I had never received from my own father. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Vivienne chose her counsel well." I stood up, tucking the leather folder under my arm. I smoothed the lapels of my practical navy blazer, the same blazer my mother had demanded I upgrade before entering this building. I turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving the hushed, expensive silence of the law firm behind me. I rode the elevator down to the lobby alone. The descent felt entirely different from the agonizing ride up. The crushing pressure of my mother's expectations, the financial terror of my maxed-out credit card, and the suffocating invisibility of my role as the unfavored daughter had all evaporated. I walked out through the revolving glass doors and onto the busy downtown pavement. The midday sun had burned off the morning chill, casting a bright, unforgiving light across the concrete grid of Columbus. The city buzzed with the chaotic, relentless energy of commerce and transit. I stopped near the edge of the sidewalk, waiting for the crosswalk signal. I reached into the right pocket of my blazer, my fingers brushing against the cold, smooth metal of the vintage ring. I pulled it out, holding it up to the natural light. The square-cut emerald sparked brilliantly, the deep green color hiding a complex network of internal fractures. The Jardine. The flaws that proved it was genuine, the scars that proved it was tough. Alyssa had worn it on her left hand, treating it like a fragile prop in a curated aesthetic performance. She had worn it to project an illusion of value she had not earned. I slid the gold band onto my right index finger. It fit perfectly, settling over my knuckle with a comforting, familiar weight. It was not a prop. It was a piece of armor. The crosswalk signal chirped, turning white. I stepped off the curb, merging into the flow of the city. I was walking toward my repaired 10-year-old sedan, parked in the subterranean garage. I still had to route freight trucks for the rest of the week. I still had to manage supply chain bottlenecks at the terminal. The work did not vanish simply because I was now a multi-million-dollar commercial landlord. But the nature of the work had fundamentally changed. I was no longer an invisible employee grinding away to survive the week. I was the owner of the ground my employer stood on. The silent grind was over, and the real empire building was just beginning. The transition of power was absolute. Over the next 12 months, the reality of my grandmother's meticulous planning settled over my life, completely transforming the landscape of my existence. I was no longer the invisible workhorse, trapped in a cramped apartment, routing freight trucks to survive the month. I was the sole proprietor of a commercial empire. I formally resigned from my position at Midwest Central Logistics. The departure was profoundly satisfying. I did not burn bridges. I did not storm into the manager's office and dramatically quit. I simply submitted my 2 weeks' notice, packed my desk, and walked out the front doors. A month later, I returned to the exact same building, not as an employee, but as the owner of the ground upon which the entire corporate structure rested. I sat across the table from my former superiors, negotiating the renewal terms of their triple net lease. They treated me with a cautious, deferential respect that felt entirely unfamiliar, but remarkably comfortable. I used a fraction of the immediate capital from the LLC holdings to open my own logistics consulting firm. I built a sleek, minimalist office space directly on a small, previously undeveloped parcel of the Greenstone Industrial Park. I hired my own team of analysts, focusing on optimizing high-value supply chains across the Midwest. I was building my own legacy, rooted firmly in the foundation Vivian had secured for me. The fallout from my family was exactly as devastating as attorney Mitchell Thorne had predicted. The sale of the residential property on Willow Creek Drive dragged through probate court for nearly 10 months. By the time the house finally closed, the net proceeds were immediately consumed by the massive debt Karen and Alyssa had accumulated. Alyssa's extravagant engagement party had set a dangerous precedent. Convinced they were about to inherit millions, she and my mother had signed non-refundable contracts for a spectacular high society wedding. They booked a premium country club venue, hired elite caterers, and commissioned custom-imported floral arches. When the commercial trust was irrevocably transferred to me, they were left holding the bag for tens of thousands of dollars in vendor liabilities. The vendors did not care about family drama. They cared about their invoices. When my parents defaulted on the payments, the accounts were swiftly sent to aggressive collections agencies. The financial pressure fractured Alyssa's relationship with Chad. The mediocre sales representative had been banking on marrying into wealth. When he realized Alyssa was not an heiress, but rather a heavily indebted liability, the engagement dissolved. Chad broke off the wedding, leaving Alyssa to handle the shattered remnants of her curated digital narrative. Her social media following dwindled as she could no longer afford to subsidize her aesthetic lifestyle. She moved back into my parents' newly downsized modest apartment, forced to confront the harsh reality of an unearned existence. Karen and David were fundamentally broken by the exposure. The illusion of their suburban prestige was annihilated. They could no longer afford their country club memberships or their leased luxury vehicles. The extended family, the very audience my mother had spent her life performing for, finally saw behind the curtain. The Whisper network shifted. Karen was no longer the tragic, devoted matriarch. She was the woman who tried to steal her own daughter's inheritance and bankrupted herself in the process. They attempted to contact me, especially during the holidays. My phone would buzz with voicemails from my mother. The messages were carefully constructed, dripping with a sweet, manufactured melancholy. She would talk about how much they missed me, how families should stick together through difficult times, and how they were ready to forgive the past and move forward. She never acknowledged the extortion, the gaslighting, or the theft. She only wanted access to the capital I now controlled. I never answered the calls. I never responded to the text messages. I simply let them go to voicemail, listening to the desperate, hollow sound of their fabricated affection before pressing delete. The silence that I used to wield as a shield when I lived under their roof was now the impenetrable boundary that protected my peace. I did not block their numbers. I did not need to. I wanted them to know that the lines of communication were open, but I was actively choosing to ignore them. The power dynamic had permanently reversed. They were no longer the gatekeepers of my worth. They were just static on a disconnected line. The ultimate stroke of poetic justice occurred on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. My logistics consulting firm had recently acquired a new client. It was a large, aggressive debt collection agency based in Cleveland. They hired my team to optimize the routing schedules for their field agents, aiming to increase the efficiency of their asset recovery operations across the state of Ohio. I sat at my desk reviewing a stack of fresh routing assignments. The large windows of my office overlooked the bustling shipping lanes of the industrial park. I flipped through the printed manifests, checking the addresses against the regional transit maps. My eyes stopped on a specific entry. It was a residential address, located in a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of Columbus. The names listed on the recovery docket were Karen and Alyssa Stevens. The primary debtor flag indicated severe delinquency on multiple high-value event vendor accounts. I stared at the paperwork for a long time. The collection agency was sending a field agent to repossess assets from my mother and sister to satisfy the very wedding debts they had accrued trying to outshine me. And I was the one directing the agent to their front door. I did not reroute the agent. I did not intervene to save them. I picked up my pen and signed the authorization, sending the optimized schedule down to the dispatch floor. I treated them exactly how they had always treated me, like a transaction. I leaned back in my leather chair, turning my gaze toward the window. The autumn sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the concrete and steel of my empire. They had spent 26 years trying to keep me in the dark. They had convinced themselves that I was useless so they could justify using me. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my compliance was stupidity. But the thing about keeping someone in the dark is that you never see what they are building. You never see the foundation being poured. You never see the steel beams being welded together. And when the lights finally come on, it is too late. The structure is already standing, and you realize you are locked outside the gates. I reached up and brushed a stray lock of hair behind my ear. As I moved my hand, the sunlight caught the facets of the vintage emerald resting perfectly on my right index finger. The jardine inside the stone flared brilliantly, illuminating the tough, resilient fractures that had survived immense pressure. The gem was a promise fulfilled. It was a legacy reclaimed. I looked at the green stone, a quiet smile settling across my face. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the unfavored daughter. My name is Nina Stevens, and this is my empire. There is a uniquely American mythology built around the formal dining room table. We are raised on the imagery of roasted turkeys, clinking crystal, and perfectly pressed linens, believing that the family gathered around the centerpiece is the ultimate sanctuary from a harsh and unforgiving world. We are taught that blood is thicker than water, that parents inherently act out of unconditional love, and that the traditional family structure is a fortress of fairness and moral guidance. But what happens when the architects of that fortress are obsessed with the facade rather than the structural integrity? What happens when the dining room table becomes a stage for extortion, and the people passing the side dishes are the very ones slowly erasing your existence? When we look closely at the lives of children forced into the shadows of their own homes, children like Tori, whose father signed away her future to fund a favored son, like Arya, whose mother literally stole her vehicle and rebranded the theft as generosity, or like Ivy, whose mother actively sabotaged her career to protect a false suburban narrative. We are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth about parental responsibility. We are forced to ask what it truly means to guide a child into adulthood. In many traditional family dynamics, there is a dangerous confusion between keeping the peace and emotional cowardice. Parents often prioritize social optics and neighborhood prestige over the raw, messy reality of emotional awareness. They assign roles to their children early on: the golden child who serves as the shiny extension of the parent's ego, and the scapegoat, the flexible, invisible workhorse expected to absorb the family's friction. The parents operate under the delusion that sweeping injustice under the rug is an act of maintaining harmony. But a peace that requires a child to swallow their own voice is not peace at all. It is simply silent warfare. The profound tragedy of this dynamic is not just the immediate theft of resources, be it a college fund, a car, or a grandmother's ring. The true theft is the systematic dismantling of a child's self-worth. When a mother stares at the floor while her daughter is robbed, or publicly mocks her child's competence to garner a cheap laugh at an engagement party, she is actively planting seeds of lifelong self-doubt. She is teaching her child that their value is entirely conditional, dictated by how much abuse they are willing to endure without making a scene. Yet conventional wisdom constantly urges the overlooked child to forgive, to be the bigger person, and to understand that parents are just doing their best. We are conditioned to believe that family loyalty demands infinite grace. But true parenting values honesty, fairness, and absolute emotional awareness require us to abandon this toxic sentimentality. If we are to raise children who can survive the brutal realities of the world, we must first ensure they can survive us. Fairness does not mean dividing every dollar equally. It means applying accountability equally. Look closely at the favored children in these narratives. Look at Marcus, drowning in credit card debt after burning through stolen money. Look at Meredith, paralyzed by the fear of losing her mother's applause. By shielding the favored child from the consequences of their actions, by artificially propping them up with stolen funds and fabricated praise, these parents did not love them. They crippled them. They sent them out into a world that does not care about their mother's neighborhood association status, entirely unequipped to handle the word no. Conversely, the overlooked children, the ones told they lacked potential, the ones told to learn a trade or to stop being dramatic, were forced to build their empires in the dark. They developed the jardin, the internal fractures that make a stone incredibly tough. They learned to route the freight trucks, write the code, and manage the commercial land precisely because no one was coming to save them. The pain inflicted by their parents inadvertently forged a resilience that could never be inherited. But resilience born of trauma is a heavy inheritance. As a society, we must demand better from the traditional family structure. We must recognize that guiding a child long-term means telling the truth even when the truth is ugly. It means sitting at the kitchen table and admitting when we are wrong, rather than rewriting history to protect our own fragile egos. It means looking at our children as independent souls with their own unique trajectories, not as props in a curated social media feed. If you have ever sat at a holiday table feeling entirely invisible, or if you have ever had to build your own life from the scraps your family left behind, you are not alone. Your silence was not weakness, it was preparation. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to Jessica Told Stories, where we shine a light on the quiet battles fought behind closed doors and celebrate the strength it takes to finally walk away. As we reflect on these families, we are left with a sobering realization that directly challenges the core of our cultural mythology. We are told that family is forever, that cutting ties is a profound moral failure, and that the highest virtue is forgiveness. But forgiveness is not a prerequisite for healing, and shared DNA is not a binding contract for perpetual abuse. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is let a child fail. And sometimes the most profoundly healthy, self-respecting decision a child can make is to look at the people who gave them life and walk completely out of theirs. Love without boundaries is simply a door without a lock. It invites thieves to take what shines and call it tradition. True empowerment begins the moment you realize that the table you have been desperately trying to earn a seat at is rotting from the inside out. You do not need their permission to leave. You only need the courage to build your own table in the silence they left behind. When the lights finally come on, you may find yourself alone, but for the first time in your life, you will finally be in good company.